one wonders what escape there is from the apparent cul-de-sac in which modernism seems to have found itself. An escape is possible by a certain sacrifice of dogma. For instance, by a more frank recognition of the influence of surroundings upon the choice of materials and the technique of their use. Or could not the advantages of modern developments be combined with materials that, though not modern, have stood the practical test of time more satisfactorily than some modern materials ever seem likely to do? Use modern materials is the correct slogan, I believe. Use common sense is better.
In asking for common sense, Sir Giles Gilbert Scott was probing the Achilles heel of the modern movement, the preference for dogma rather than practicality, and the rejection of well-tried solutions in favour of the new aesthetic. At the same conference, Professor T.H. Hughes was more forthright.
This modern movement is nothing more or less than a disease. I think 90% of modern work in art, music, painting and sculpture is pure rubbish. We seem to have forgotten the traditions and natural developments of our own country. Most so-called modern British buildings show either American or Egyptian influence, or the latest tricks from France or Germany in reinforced concrete. What is the usual stock in trade of modern designers in domestic work? A bold flatness, enormous chilly windows with horizontal bars generally pushed to the extreme angles of the building, lofty windows to force the contrast at intervals, and a few balconies pushed in here and there with more horizontal bars as a source of danger to the children who may climb them. If we cannot afford to employ the materials which some continental architect has used, then we imitate the concrete in brick and plaster and whitewash it. Some of the designers of the so-called modern buildings may be sincere in their aim. They may honestly be striving to reflect the age in its economical problems and its scientific developments. But how many are sincere? If we apply with knowledge the latest developments of science, a true modern architecture must develop. If we start off ignorant of the mechanical properties of our modern materials and strive for novelty, we have made a false start. A sincere modern architecture, slowly evolved, will still remain British, but given a sound start, may develop a beauty of its own, a beauty equal to that of the Parthenon, Santa Sophia, or Amiens.
This well-argued case shows that the wind of change was blowing in the architectural establishment of the 30s. If we scan the architectural publications of the time, we find a wide variety of styles. The problem was one of vocabulary. Many architects felt the new buildings of the modern movement were inadequate, but could discover no convincing alternative. Buildings of classical inspiration had more authority and were preferred because of a persistent belief in classical ideals. Vincent Harris's Central Library at Manchester shows how this kind of Italianate expression maintained the widely held view that architecture should be richly modelled and should offer sculpted forms of power and subtlety. the Italian Renaissance had a very powerful grip, and the conservative view of architects was echoed in the stress laid in architectural education upon Beaux-Arts ideals. This was a situation which persisted into the 1950s. If we look at this Rome Prize in Architecture for 1930, we can understand the high regard not simply for the picturesque aspects of Renaissance design, but also the intellectual discipline involved in Beaux-Arts planning. The elevation is restrained but quite magnificent, discreetly modern but with more than a suggestion of the Basilica of Maxentius. The upper windows and classical niches with statuary leave us in no doubt that this is a Rome scholar. This majestic solution had all the grandeur that was expected of a Rome winner: an axial plan, elaborate formal garden, the drawings executed in tasteful sepia wash. There's a section containing vaulted areas which confirms the Italianate character of the spaces. The architect of this Museum of Archaeology in a Mediterranean city was W.G. Holford, later to become Lord Holford, Professor of Town Planning at University College London, responsible among other projects for the post-war development around St. Paul's Cathedral. But the Beaux-Arts system had its limitations. Buildings tended to be conceived in terms of elevation, section and plan, and this often led to a rather static understanding of space. But the system was easy to understand and to teach. There was a well-established theory and system of rules, ranging from the correct disposition of elements, usually on a symmetrical basis, to the correct way to design the capital of a column. Architecture consisted very largely of formal composition for its own sake, and the careful pencil drawing or sepia wash was the means by which sensitivity could be developed. For example, this Italian composition by a second-year student at the Liverpool School of Architecture. Incidentally, Holford himself had been a student at the Liverpool School. It was Professor Charles Riley who made the Liverpool School into possibly the leading architectural school in Britain. The school buildings, designed by Budden and Marshall, were at the time considered to be very modern. But look into the courtyard. Tradition is never very far away. Formerly, most architects had been educated under the pupillage system, but Riley formed an educational establishment based on Beaux-Arts ideals which commanded enormous respect in the architectural profession, and whose students managed to win the Rome Scholarship with monotonous regularity. In 1931, Professor Riley published his book, Representative British Architects, featuring buildings like the RAC in Pall Mall by Arthur J. Davis, who'd been educated at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris.
Some of the most exquisite detail in London.
Davis also designed the Westminster Bank in Threadneedle Street, London, based on the 16th century Massimi Palace in Rome.
A fine Roman boldness and strength with that consistency of character which only the artist who is a scholar achieves.
A section on the work of W. Curtis Green describes his Stratton House, Piccadilly, as being peculiarly successful.
The great pilastered order on which the whole building stands, embracing the shops and the floor above, with a San Michele flat-arched treatment in between, is, I think, one of the pleasantest pieces of recent design we have.
Sir Edwin Lutyen's palace for the Viceroy at New Delhi was nearing completion.
The way Sir Edwin has managed to revivify our English Palladian tradition with its great monumental staircases, surrounded with wide marble corridors vaulted like the aisles of St. Paul's, and the whole thing crowned with a great dome, the strength and outline of which is something new in architectural detail. This building will burst upon the world with as great a revelation of modern achievement as did Liverpool Cathedral.
These were the high points of monumental architecture: Liverpool Cathedral by Sir Giles Gilbert Scott, President of the RIBA in 1935, and Sir Edwin Lutyens' Viceroy's Palace. The immense compositional skill employed in such buildings posed a considerable challenge to the modern movement, whose vocabulary was of a totally different order. But it was not only monumental architecture which enjoyed the confidence of architect and patron alike. In domestic work, Britain has established a sound tradition of beautiful country houses. This is Heathcote at Ilkley in Yorkshire by Lutyens in the Italianate manner of San Michele. Here's Guy Dawber's Ashley Chase in Dorset. Dawber's work was in the local tradition. It belonged to its situation, sometimes in stone, sometimes in brick. These almshouses at Rochester typify his approach. In domestic work, it was the arts and crafts philosophy which survived. As in monumental works, it was New Renaissance. The power of this imagery persuaded most architects not only to achieve, but to emulate the work of such men. All over England, right through the 30s and beyond, we have buildings of this kind appearing in town and country. Modern buildings were the exception. Building societies were suspicious of them and hesitated to lend money, believing the style to be transient, a passing phase. So on the one hand, we have the traditional school, and at the other extreme, the modern movement. But there was a middle path. Many British architects became interested in a type of building which had begun to appear in Scandinavia and the Netherlands during the 1920s. This is Hilversum Town Hall, built in brick by W. Dudok in 1929. This proved more acceptable to most British architects than the stark concrete forms of the modernists. Gunnar Aspland's Stockholm City Library of 1927 is highly successful in being neither too traditional nor too modern. Simplicity and classical restraint are exemplified in Thomson and Hagen's Oregaard's School, built in Copenhagen between 1922 and 1924. This then was the situation in 1932, when this announcement was published in the RIBA Journal. The RIBA invite architects, being members or students of the RIBA, to submit in competition designs for new premises and headquarters. It goes on to say, it should be borne in mind that the new RIBA building, by reason of its representative character, is likely to be held by the present and future generations of architects and the general public to be an example of the best work of our time. So, this was a building which had to crystallize the professional image of the architectural establishment of the time. There were 280 entries for the competition, and this design took second prize, a scheme by Werner O. Ries. The exterior is very monumental, using the stripped classical idiom popularized by Scandinavian architects. Compositionally, it suffers from being split almost in half at the point where the upper floors of the offices rest on the more ceremonial lower section. The subdivision into piers and vertical window strips seems rather tentative and lacking in positive identity and real conviction. But the main problem facing the architect was the planning of the interior, and this design rated highly because of the clear definition of the main spaces. There's an impressive entrance hall in the shape of a Greek cross, leading to the meeting room, which is placed centrally on the ground floor. Again, at second floor level, the library vestibule gives a splendid approach to the council room, and the library itself is cleverly subdivided. This scheme is typical of Beaux-Arts planning: axial, with good proportions, well thought out spaces and circulation zones, and it's mainly cellular, with little attempt at the interpenetration of space. The third prize, won by Percy Thomas, has a grand central corridor around which the main rooms are disposed, and again the individual areas are carefully considered. The central hall and reference section of the library are particularly dignified, with more than a hint of classicism suggested. If the plan lacks the conviction of the second prize winner, the elevation is better composed, although it still has a rather anonymous character. Neither of these designs has an exterior which says much about the interior, and although both are competent, They're backward-looking and rather sterile. A fair indication of how well-worn, even played out, was this particular approach to design. The competition, in fact, was won by a relatively unknown architect, Gray Wernham. And here's what L.W. Thornton White, a noted architectural critic of the time, said about his design.
In this first-placed design, there was no ground floor plan spreading its obvious compartments before the familiar eye. No corridors to be broken up by the reflected line of imaginary beam or vault. No minor details working perfectly enough to curb the criticism of the trivial. Indeed, on the face of it, scarcely a plan at all. Instead, a conception of spaces, each designed in length and breadth and height for a special purpose, and all proportioned together sensitively, intelligently, grandly, to form an interior of exceptional quality.
His elevational treatment is altogether more positive than the other designs we've seen. The Portland Place front is dominated by a large central window. In Charles Riley's words,
"It is a fine central feature and gives the whole building character. Without it, no one would guess at the great halls within for exhibition and other purposes. I find the building quiet yet inviting, suggesting delights within. Not only a building with a magnificent plan and still more magnificent section, but a building full of life and youth and happiness."
Bainbridge Copnall sculpted 5 relief figures on the Weymouth Street facade. The sculptor, the artisan, the architect, the mechanic, and the painter. And on the front, over the main entrance, a figure representing architecture. The main entrance doors by James Woodford show London's river and its buildings. As we come in, we find ourselves in a low, wide entrance hall which draws you towards the stairs.
It is the stair that entrances me. It is broad and dignified, with fine vistas down into the foyer of the Henry Jarvis Memorial Hall and up to the great silver-barred window. But it is no merely monumental stair leading to an over-upholstered council chamber and mayor's parlour. It is one which makes even an old fellow like myself feel inclined to walk up lightly on his toes and full of expectation.
This was Wernham's achievement. Instead of impressive individual spaces of an all too familiar kind, he produced a design in which the entrance stair led to a vertical space, and from the various levels of this space you get views up, down, and across. Virtually one grand space was formed in the heart of the building, well lit and of splendid proportions. You can see how the stairwell is the core of the building. From entrance level, the stairs lead down to the Henry Jarvis Hall, which is tucked right under the building. Right above it is the largest room in the building, the Henry Florence Hall. It's reached from the first floor landing. And you can see right into it from the stairs. Describing the Henry Florence Hall, Professor Riley said it was
a place for elegant clothes, for wit and controlled laughter. I am told it will be used mainly for examinations. If examinations are held there, I'm sure the standard of the results will rise. In so lofty and happy an apartment, the mind is bound to expand. What more could one say in praise of any piece of architecture?
The panels between the windows depict man and his buildings through the ages. It's all rather like a cathedral, employing the work of many different craftsmen in stone, glass and plaster. And the sculptors even took the same license which cathedral craftsmen often did, by including a caricature of the architect, Grey Wernham, with his monocle. In fact, Grey Wernham set up a workshop on the site where the different artists and craftsmen could improvise and experiment. These panels on the ceiling of the hall show them at work.
The new library is a light, airy laboratory by day or night, with open access to the books where real work can be done.
With its long window, clean lines and lack of ornament, this is the most uncompromisingly modern room in the building. By contrast, the council chamber with its walnut panelling has a more traditional mood. But the long window on the right and the simplified lines and surfaces are far from being quotations from the past. Raymond McGrath's sand-blasted glass panels epitomize the spirit of the building.
We are at a transition stage in everything. The past is ceasing to hold us, and the future can only be seen in dim outlines. Wernham might have designed, and probably would have enjoyed doing so, an entirely modern building with no roots in the past at all. A similar building to represent architecture in most foreign countries would no doubt be so. With us, however, and for such a conservative institution as the RIBA, it would not be a truthful expression, or even an idealized expression, of the attitude of a large section, let alone a majority, of the members to their work. The revolutionaries among us, though I thoroughly believe the future is theirs, are still a small minority.
The success of the building is evident from reviews in professional journals and the daily press alike. Most critics liked the way decoration was included in the building. A few did not. In having so much literal description, the RIBA building was one of the last descendants of the ancient architectural tradition. But a wind of change was blowing, and the discerning critic of country life wrote,
Swedish charm and British competence, it might be said, are married in the Royal Institute of British Architects' new building. It is significant that the most completely satisfying room is the library, where decoration is wholly absent, and the effect is got by the ingenious and direct treatment of the parts.
The Radio Times saw it as
a rare case of a physician healing himself.